Take a look at this semi-famous image of an important Soviet official by the name of Boris Yeltsin visiting an American supermarket in 1989. Now, Yeltsin is not massively on our course. He'll come up for a very small amount in one of our future lessons. But the reason we care about him now is that he was an important ally of the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. So pause this video and try to think why his ally visiting an American supermarket could help end the Cold War. The next two slides have an account of Yeltsin's visit to this supermarket, and it ends on a direct quote from his autobiography. Now, if you can't bother to listen to me reading this out for a couple of minutes, just skip ahead to the last slide. Boris Yeltsin and a handful of Soviet officials were visiting a NASA space center in Texas, America. They made an unannounced visit to a Randall's supermarket on their way back to the airport. The fact this unannounced and unplanned was so important. Yeltsin is going to see some truly astonishing things from here. So the fact that it was unplanned means the American government couldn't have planned for it. They couldn't have prepped the supermarket and made it look spectacular. In other words, what Yeltsin saw was what he would have seen on any other day of the year. Shoppers and employees stopped him to shake his hand and say hello. Now that by itself wasn't amazing because by 1989, the year he was there, relations between America and the Soviet Union were far better than in previous years. What was amazing was the things in the store. He asked customers about what they were buying and how much it cost. He later asked the store manager if one needed a special education to manage a store. In the photos, you can see him marveling at the produce fresh fish market and the checkout counter. He looked especially excited with the frozen Jello pudding pops. Now, that's not really a brand in Britain. In America, it's really budget or cheap and cheerful. An American could buy that for easily less than $1. But in the Soviet Union, that sort of thing was basically unheard of. Even party members don't have this choice. Not even Mr. Gorbachev, he said. In other words, he's saying that even the leader of a superpower does not get the range of choices and the quality of the food that an average American can go to in a supermarket. The fact that stores like these were on every street corner in America amazed him. They even offered free cheese samples. As he left, he was given a small bag of goodies to enjoy on his trip. On the plane ride to Yeltsin's next destination, he was depressed. He couldn't stop thinking about the plentiful food at the grocery store and what his countrymen had to survive on in the USSR. In his autobiography, he wrote about his visit to Randall's supermarket, which shattered his view of communism. 2 years later, he left the Communist Party and began making reforms to turn the economic tide in the Soviet Union. You can blame those frozen Jello pudding pops. Yeltsin said in his autobiography, "When I saw those shelves crammed with hundreds, thousands of cans, cartons of goods of every possible sort, for the first time I felt quite frankly sick with despair for the Soviet people. That such a potentially super rich country as ours has been brought to a state of such poverty, it is terrible to think of it." So this is a man who spent most of his adult life working within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This is a man who was born within the Soviet Union. He's never known anything other than communism, and he was someone that believed in it. But because of that unplanned visit to a capitalist supermarket, his entire worldview started to crumble away. So with all that in mind, that might give you an idea as to how this event helped change the Cold War for the better. Now, this lesson, we're not going to be focusing too much on Yeltsin. We're going to be focusing on his leader at this point, Mikhail Gorbachev, and why he wanted to end the Cold War. This is the first in a series of lessons where we'll look at Gorbachev and Reagan's roles in ending all of those tensions. Now, that seems a little bit weird considering everything we learned about Reagan's aggressive foreign policy in previous lessons. But once Gorbachev is in power, Reagan will begin to change his mind, and he'll be a major reason why America wants to work with the Soviet Union. There are two essential vocabulary there, which are a little bit scary perhaps, Glasnost and perestroika. Both of these are absolutely crucial that you must know for the exam board. On the desirable, as always, we've got things which would be better to learn, such as Lada, Buscarini, and the difference between a free market and a black market. Going back over what we did last lesson, Reagan was American president from 1981 to 1989. He had the unusual situation of having to deal with multiple Soviet leaders. Most presidents only had to deal with one or maybe two, because Soviet leaders tended to last a very long time. Unfortunately for Reagan, his first three were not good leaders to deal with. You have Brezhnev at the end of détente after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then you have two short leaders in quick succession, Andropov and Chernenko. Both of those were hardline communists. Remember, Andropov was the leader who called Reagan insane and compared him to Adolf Hitler. Chernenko became leader in 1984, having already been diagnosed with lung cancer. He actually hadn't wanted the job. He had wanted it to be passed on to Gorbachev. Once Chernenko dies, Gorbachev takes control. Now, compared to the rest of the leaders, Gorbachev was a spring chicken. He became leader at the age of 54. That doesn't sound particularly young, but he was literally a generation younger than either Brezhnev, Andropov, or Chernenko. Gorbachev was born in the 1930s. By that point, Brezhnev was already a working member of the Communist Party. During the invasion of Hungary in 1956, Andropov was the Soviet ambassador to Hungary. He was the man pressuring Khrushchev and convincing him that Hungarians had to be crushed. Gorbachev wasn't involved in any of this. He was a lifelong member of the Communist Party. Like Boris Yeltsin, he believed in communism. But because he had been raised in a very different communist atmosphere to someone like Brezhnev or Andropov, he had very different ideas about how communism had to work in order to survive. So we need to look at why the Soviet Union was in such trouble by the time Gorbachev came to power in the 1980s. And for that, we need to go over quite a few basic ideas of communism and some of the hangovers from Stalin's time as leader. For 40 years, it had supported communist countries around the world through the Comecon. So all of Eastern Europe and places like Cuba or any other places where the Soviet Union wanted to extend its economic control. Then we talked about the fact that the Comecon tended to be quite exploitative. In other words, it would take loads of things out of those Eastern European countries. But that doesn't mean it was free. That meant that a lot of the time, prices in the Soviet Union and in wider Eastern Europe were subsidized. The government paid part of the price of most goods. Remember, the whole point of communism is that it's supposed to support poorer people or the working classes. So if the cost of a basic luxury, like petrol or cigarettes or vodka, was too expensive, then the government will pay a high part of that price. If you do this for many, many people over many, many years, that would be a massive drain on government finances. In a truly capitalist society, there is no subsidization at all. Now, really, we don't live in a truly capitalist society. If you think about the NHS, for example, the government subsidizes the cost of any prescription. So it doesn't matter what sort of medicine you're buying from your pharmacy. If you've got a prescription for it, it's £7 or £8, can't actually remember now. So it doesn't matter if the medicine costs £7 or £7,000. The government will pay most, if not some, of that fee. Going back to the Soviet Union, military spending had risen far too high across the entire Cold War. Partly this was to keep pace with America, and if you think about Reagan's massive increase in military spending, that $1 trillion over 6 years, the Soviet Union couldn't even keep up with that, but they had to at least try. And the final straw was the invasion of Afghanistan from 1979 up to 1989. It really was the Soviet Union's war in Vietnam. And when we look at the war in Vietnam in year 11, you'll get a greater sense of how costly that sort of war could be. Finally, the Soviet Union relied on food and in particular technology imports for the West. The Soviet Union and communism in general had failed to keep pace with the range of technological innovations. We're getting to the point where what we would now call a modern computer is being developed. And while they had everything they needed in a Soviet economy to make it, they lacked the basic ideas or the basic infrastructure, or more importantly, the basic innovation. Your average Soviet worker didn't have an incentive to make those sorts of things because it wasn't part of the economy properly. There's a weird thing in economics where to purchase foreign goods, you need foreign money. Nowadays, we don't really think about it, particularly if you're just going to go to France, you'll buy some euros. If you're going to go to America, you'll buy some dollars. But if you are an entire country, you need a vast amount of euros or a vast amount of dollars. The way you do that is by selling your goods abroad. So you need good exports. You need to be able to sell loads of things in foreign countries. But because Soviet goods weren't particularly good, they had poor exports. So without selling loads of things abroad, you don't get loads of dollars. And without loads of dollars, you can't buy American goods. Without loads of pounds, you can't buy many British things. So let's get an idea of what an average Soviet export looked like. These Lada cars. These Soviet exports were often incredibly poor quality compared to a similar price British or French or German good. So the Lada cars had a standard glut of jokes. We'll go through a couple of those to break up the boredom of this lesson. How can you double the value of your Lada? Oh, you can fill it with petrol because the cost of petrol is really high and the Lada is really rubbish. Oh, funny. What do you call a Lada with a sunroof? You just like peel it back. Oh, it's a skip. Oh, the car is useless. Final one. What do you call a Lada driver who says he has a speeding ticket? Go on, I'm making it this one. Oh, he's a liar because they can't go more than like 50 miles an hour. Oh dear, it's funnier if you're in person. But the point is, in the Soviet Union, the Lada car was highly desirable. The cost of trying to buy a Ford or a Mini or something like that would be astronomically high to get it brought into the Soviet Union. There's not that many Ladas or similar types of cars available in the Soviet Union, so people would be on years-long waiting lists trying to get one, and they would be fairly happy once they got it, as long as they didn't see their neighbour, who was a multi-millionaire, was able to get something like a Ford or a Mini or something like that. So why was the Soviet economy so bad at producing these sorts of goods? We talked about the idea of a lack of incentive or a lack of reason for workers to raise the quality of their work. If you're all guaranteed a job, if you're all guaranteed a house, if you're all guaranteed access to public services, why should you work harder than someone who's next to you, or your neighbour, or your brother? Officially, unemployment had been at zero. Now, obviously, that wasn't actually true. But again, in a truly communist society, everyone is looked after. So the Soviet government had essentially lied for getting on to 60 years and said, we're always able to find someone a job. Now, without true incentives, businesses don't really have to compete either. In a capitalist economy like America or Britain, businesses have to compete. You can compete by lowering prices, you can compete by selling more goods, or you can compete by making those goods better than other people. So if you think about the classic thing between like Android and Apple or Samsung versus Apple, generally speaking, Samsung phones tend to be cheaper, Apple phones tend to be better, or at least they say they're better, and they're more expensive because of it. So if you have that sort of competition, people have got clear choices. When they make those choices, one company does better than the other. Obviously, Samsung and Apple are both hugely successful companies, but compare it to something like Nokia, which isn't really a company anymore. It failed to innovate, so its mobiles have massively plummeted compared to 20 years ago. If the workers don't compete to produce high quality goods, they're either fired if they're truly awful at it, or they can be ignored for promotions, or they don't get raises compared to some of their workers. So again, from a business level and a worker level, all of them will compete to do better if they want more money. In a communist system, there is no reason to compete because you won't get more money than the person next to you or the business across the road. There's also a huge black market in Western goods and currency in the Soviet Union at this point. A black market is an illegal market. So you would trade illegally from someone down the road or someone whose brother was able to go to America and sneak some goods in. Tourists would be offered Russian rubles, their currency, for the US dollars in their pocket at 3 times the official exchange rate. The US dollar was so valuable, you would pay more than it should have been worth to get its real worth. Again, it's a really confusing point. If you haven't got a very good economic mind, I would just push past that. The whole point is the Soviet communist economy lacked incentives, so goods were either rubbish or too expensive or simply not desirable. So Gorbachev wanted to try and solve the Soviet Union's many problems. To do this, he needed to reform the communist society. He needed to reform the Soviet Union's entire model of communism. So we've got two previous leaders that we've seen do this sort of thing before. We have had Nagy in Hungary in 1956, and we've had Dubček in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Both of these people were communists, or at least they were socialists. They believed that the current form of communism they were working under wasn't right. But they had been crushed first by Khrushchev in 1956 and then by Brezhnev in 1968. So both times the Soviet leader has stepped in to crush an Eastern European country becoming less communist. But now Gorbachev is the leader of the Soviet Union. He gets to decide the direction of the Soviet Union, and by extension, he could decide the direction of the rest of Eastern Europe. Now, Gorbachev can't do this just by himself. He needed to drum up support for this, not only in the actual Communist Party, but also in the rest of the Soviet Union. Because Gorbachev wants change, many Soviet Union people will want change, but many more will also want to keep things the same. If they've only ever known this, if they are die-hard supporters of the current system, like Chimenko or Andropov, he's going to face an uphill battle. So he would go to places like factories and supermarkets and schools and try and lobby people for change. So we've got a photo of him here, just in a random group of people trying to build up support for his reforms, which we'll go on to in a later slide. Imagine Stalin trying to do this. Stalin wasn't someone that believed in people's opinions. That sounds far too democratic for his liking. He would change things, and if people didn't support it, he would have them removed or he would have them killed. Gorbachev knows forcing change didn't work. You have to encourage people to want those changes. So over the next couple of lessons, we're going to look at how Gorbachev ended the Cold War. He didn't like the Cold War, but he did like communism. I can't say it enough, because we're going to look at some reforms, Perestroika and Glasnost, which seem thoroughly uncommunist. But at this point in the 1980s, Gorbachev believes in communism, just a different type to someone like Brezhnev. Nowadays, because he is still alive, he doesn't believe in communism, he is a Democrat and he is a capitalist. But in the 1980s, he's trying to reform communism to keep it. In a later lesson, we'll look at how he and Reagan and Bush Sr. ended the arms race. And in one of our last lessons, we'll look at the Soviet Union ending its control over communist Eastern Europe. So first of all, we've got perestroika. We've got the phonetic way of explaining that word. So perestroika means restructuring, or if you're not comfortable with the word restructuring, it means changing. Perestroika is an economic term. He wanted to restructure or change the economy. So the economy had been damaged by the arms race, the space race, the Afghan war, and all these sorts of things that we've mentioned before. Gorbachev believes that the Soviet Union could only survive if the economy was restructured by reducing central state control. In other words, the central government doesn't tell everyone to do everything, they'll only retain control over key industries like iron or coal or oil, and introducing some aspects of a free market economy. Now, that's a phrase we haven't mentioned since the first lesson. A free market economy is essentially survive or die. So you can set up a business, and if it works, you can become successful. If it really works, you become a billionaire. If it fails, it fails for many different reasons. People don't buy it, you can't pay your rents, there's a massive earthquake and your building falls down, you didn't buy insurance like an idiot. The point is, in a free market economy, successful things survive, unsuccessful things don't. The key example of this, the one phrase you should remember from all of this on Perestroika, is that businesses can be run for personal profit. That's something which hadn't really been allowed in the Soviet Union since before Stalin's time. So for 80 years, essentially, no business could officially be run for personal profit. People would take money under the counter, but if they were found out by the Soviet government, they could be arrested, they could lose their business, or in Lenin or Stalin's time, you would simply be shot for being a capitalist traitor. So that key phrase right at the bottom, Perestroika, introduced some capitalism because businesses could be run for personal profit. The second reform is Glasnost, which literally means openness, and this refers to two different problems and two different solutions. So one problem concerns openness within the Soviet Union. Most Soviet citizens were either unhappy or disillusioned with communism. They had lived under this system and realised that it wasn't working, and they wanted a raft of changes. That's what prompted the Hungarian uprising, that's what prompted the Czechoslovakian uprising, and several other protests and uprisings which we don't cover in our course. Across the entire Cold War, the West were deeply suspicious. Gorbachev talked about wanting change, but Khrushchev had wanted change with his de-Stalinisation and his peaceful coexistence. Brezhnev had wanted change with his détente. So why would they trust Gorbachev? Third man promising change doesn't seem very likely. So, the solution to the disillusionment was to encourage support by allowing free expression, ending censorship, and restricting the secret police of the Soviet Union, known as the KGB. We've got a very famous image here of Brezhnev and the last East German leader, a man by the name of Honecker. This was the socialist fraternal kiss. This is based off a real photo which happened. But this photo has been twisted into a mural to mock this. The title of this mural or this graffiti piece is, "My God, help me to survive this deadly love." That sort of thing would never have been allowed while Brezhnev was alive. It never would have been allowed under Khrushchev or Stalin or Lenin or Chernenko or Andropov. But Gorbachev specifically says, if you want to criticize the Soviet government, you are allowed to criticize the Soviet government. If you want to criticize me, that's absolutely fine. You can't say, I want Gorbachev to die, just in the same way I can't really say I want our current Prime Minister to die. I can criticize them, but I can't openly wish their death, or at least I could be imprisoned or fined or cautioned for that sort of thing. So we're not saying any free expression is allowed under Glasnost, but it's definitely freer expression, the ending of censorship, and things such as that. To improve links and to decrease suspicion from the West, Glasnost also hinted at more openness and links with the West. Now, these sorts of things had been promised under the 1975 Helsinki Agreement. Now, those three baskets of agreements, you have European borders being promised, you have human rights being promised, and you have discussions to open up trade links, particularly for technology and the economy. So Gorbachev announced with the West that we want to re-establish those sorts of promises from the Helsinki Agreement. Now that by itself wouldn't really help. As I've said, the West have been burned multiple times by Khrushchev and Brezhnev. So they wouldn't just believe Gorbachev from his words, but he'll go on to do many other things which will further encourage this openness with the West. So we're going to end this lesson with some of the hardest questions I've asked you across the entire Cold War course. So as we did in last lesson, I'd advise maybe picking 2 or 3 different questions, but definitely have a think about question 5. So starting out with question 1, why were Gorbachev's reforms carried out, but Nagi's or Dubček's were not? So if you're listening in the video, you should already have a solid answer for that one. Number 2, think about the tensions between capitalism and communism. So we're not talking about the tensions between America and the Soviet Union, we're talking about their ideologies, their basic beliefs. This goes right back to the first lesson, so it might be worth just spending 5 minutes looking at the relevant part of that video. So we've got capitalism and democracy versus communism. How important were the tensions between these ideologies at the start of the Cold War, during détente, and then under Gorbachev's reforms? Going on to question 3, did Glasnost or Perestroika have a bigger effect on communism in the Soviet Union? Remember, Glasnost is the political side, so introducing the ideas of freedom of speech that a democracy has. So he's not allowing elections, but he's allowing the criticising of the communist government. Perestroika is the more capitalist side. It's changing the economy to allow some businesses to be run for private profit. So is communism changed more greatly by allowing some capitalism or allowing some ideas from democracy. Leading on from that again, question 4, would Glasnost or Perestroika be more likely to improve relations with the West? So again, would some place like America approve of some ideas of democracy or some capitalism being introduced in the Soviet Union? And question 5, the one which I want all of you to be thinking about, how far were Gorbachev and Reagan each responsible for ending Cold War tensions? Now, at this point, you're probably going to be answering Gorbachev. Easily we're going to be answering Gorbachev. Think of all the amazing thing he's done with Glasnost and Perestroika. Reagan, at this point, only seems to have worsened the situation. It's a bit unfair on him because we've only looked at his presidency during Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko's time. Over the next couple of lessons, we'll look at Reagan being much more willing to work with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. That therefore leads on to a stretch and challenge. Does the weakness of the Soviet Union suggest that Reagan was right to put pressure on the USSR in the arms race? And again, it's a type of question where I don't think there's a clear right answer. I would personally suggest, for question 5 and the stretch and challenge, that if it wasn't for Gorbachev, something like the arms race that Reagan started wouldn't have had the effect he wanted. Instead of Gorbachev, if another Brezhnev had become leader in 1985, I can see him just simply increasing the arms race, spending more and more money from the Soviet Union on building arms and building missiles, and those tensions not going away, and maybe the Cold War still going on for another few years or another few decades. But again, it's a sort of question where there's no clear right answer. So that's everything on Gorbachev's early attempts to end the Cold War. As I said previously, we'll look at his attempts to end the arms race and his relaxing of control over Eastern Europe.